What have we learned from asking the God question historically? Has exploring the question of God's existence contributed to philosophical or psychological progress in your view? And I also want to add there, do you think that in some sense monotheism is a progressive step from polytheism? Is there growth in our capacity for reasoning, or is there something important for psychology in that transition?
I'll take the second question first. So I have maybe, I don't know how hot a take it is, a little bit of a hot take perhaps about that. I do think that monotheistic, well, there's a caveat here, but I'll say it first without the caveat. I do think that monotheistic belief systems are, in a sense, a step forward from polytheistic belief systems. This is a bit of an old-fashioned view, which would sort of characterize more sort of primitive belief systems of, say, nature worship, which are predominant and mostly in like stateless societies. And then societies, as they become more developed, are more likely to embrace monotheistic belief systems. I mean, this is sort of the argument of Christianity, or at least like Islam in the Middle East. Now, the caveat there is I don't actually think that monotheism is doing the work here, because I think that you have similar sort of effects in India with Hinduism, which is not, at least in many forms, is not monotheistic. I mean, there are monotheistic variants, but also in China with Buddhism and sort of Taoism. So I don't actually think, and those are, but Buddhism is in some sense an atheistic religion. But the point is, I don't think it's the monotheism as such that's doing the work there. What I think the step forward lies is the systematization and organization of spiritual or religious belief around a set of specified practices and specified beliefs, where there's a sort of organized ritual, there's sort of hierarchies, and there's organized theological, philosophical work that goes into making sense of it and trying to understand it. I mean, a lot of traditional religious, like traditional Greek and Roman gods, for example, kind of just a hodgepodge of stories and bizarre personalities, which then, philosophically minded people started to think about and discuss, this doesn't really make very much sense if we interpret it all literally. And so we have to then sort of reinterpret the mythology and understand how to make sense of that. And at least it seems to be an empirical case that many societies have moved away from those types of sort of traditional polytheism or nature worship into more organized, systematized, and often universalized salvific religions. So that includes Christianity, Islam, and at least many forms of Buddhism, and some forms of Hinduism as well. And I think that universalization is actually important. Instead of having one local god who sort of serves our purposes and we try to placate them and then avoid their wrath and things like that, which is often a very traditional sort of religious perspective, we actually have a credos which specifies our relationship to the divine in a broader cosmic sense, of humanity's relationship to the divine or to the transcendent. And we have a sort of a theory about why we're here and what we're trying to achieve, or what God is trying to achieve with us or through us or something. Mm-hmm. And I think that in some sense does represent progress, in the sense that instead of thinking about ourselves in a pure particular sense of trying to live, instead of thinking about gods in a transactional sense, like we make these offerings or sacrifices or whatever, and God gives us good things, and if bad things happen, he must be mad at us. That's, I think, a very crude and primitive way of thinking about the relationship of humanity with the divine or transcendent. Instead of that, we think more about it in terms of what the nature of reality is and goodness and the man's ultimate destiny and things like that, which I think are much more important questions. And well, I mean, you have to eat and survive at a basic level. Like, there are steps one takes to get to that level. But when society reaches a certain point of sophistication, it's important to start asking those questions. And so I do think of that as somewhat of a step forward. But yeah, hopefully I've clarified that I think it's not about whether there's one or many gods as such. It's about the type of questions that are being addressed in that religious tradition and the kind of attitude that's taken towards the relationship to man and the divine. Of course, individuals within religious traditions can have all sorts of personal opinions or reasons why they're religious. I'm more talking about the sort of theology and practice of the belief system as a whole, not necessarily individuals within it.
Yeah, so the fact that religious traditions and theological traditions are tied up with scientific and philosophical and cultural progress is not necessarily a strong argument for them when you consider that, for instance, all around the world, astronomy was tied up intimately with astrology for the vast majority of human history. And it's easy to understand psychologically how you would be more motivated to study the stars if you thought they could influence harvests and people's destinies and the rise and fall of kings, etc., it would motivate you to develop more sophisticated means of tracking their movements and all the rest. But let's take a step back here, because I want to know, your answer there seemed to imply that you think that the quality of religious questions, or at least the concerns of theologians, have progressed or improved. And I tend to share that impression, certainly since the second half of the 20th century. But what is philosophical progress to your mind? And how does it differ from spiritual, psychological, or scientific progress?
Right. Well, I mean, this relates to your first question about whether we've sort of what we've learnt in asking the God question, or what progress has been made on that. And I mean, that's very hard to assess, precisely because it's hard to define what we even mean by philosophical progress. Some people who are more skeptical about the notion of philosophical progress point to the fact that many of the same questions that were asked by the ancient Greeks or ancient Indian philosophers we still ask today, like the nature of right and wrong, and how we justify knowledge, and things like that. But I personally think that there has been substantial philosophical progress, both over long and like thousands of years, and sort of shorter horizons of the last few decades. But that philosophical progress doesn't take the form of resolving the big questions such that everyone now agrees what the answer is. There may be a handful of cases where that's true, but for the most part, it is not. But that doesn't mean that there can't be progress. I think that we have a lot more to say now, let's say, than we did 2,000 years ago as a species, about, say, the nature of right and wrong, how they might be justified, what things constitute good and bad behavior, and what it is about morality that's sort of distinctive from other things that animals do, or other sort of spheres of human existence. The notion of universal, well, I was going to say here, the notion of universal human rights, although I do have some sort of technical issues with rights talk as such, but the broad notion of sort of the fundamental equality of moral status of human persons, a fairly recent development in human history, I think is a very significant one. Sort of took us a surprisingly long time to get there. But I think that reflects the difficulty inherent to the human condition in thinking universally and abstractly, rather than locally and in particular terms of our tribe, our family, or our local group, and things like that. So, like, that's an example of a very significant achievement, which I think has been assisted, or at least been bound up in, certain religious and theological developments, as I said, the universalizing religions, though I don't think it's restricted to those, which is why it's hard to answer the question, answering the God question, like, how much progress have we made, or how has that helped us? Because it's hard to know what the counterfactual would be of a society where the God question was never addressed in a significant way, and what sort of progress would have been made there. Perhaps Chinese tradition would provide the closest example, because theological discussions of the sort that monotheists have focused on are a bit different to those that interested in the Chinese tradition. It's still not a perfect comparison, because they still had a lot of beliefs that I would call sort of mystical and spiritual. But at any rate, I think it's hard to disassociate particularly because prior to the Enlightenment, there was so much, almost all intellectual inquiry was mixed to some degree with religious inquiry, or underlying beliefs about the creator or the Bible or something like that. So it's hard to dissociate the two, but I do think that over time there has been philosophical progress, and in part that has been driven by, or gone along with, people's interest in understanding the nature of God, or understanding humanity's relationship to God. And so in that sense, I think we can say there's been progress in the God question.
Well, I tend to define philosophical progress as basically the inverse of scientific progress. Science being the discipline of finding better answers to increasingly specific questions. Philosophy being the process of finding better questions to typically that focus typically on general topics. And I think in that sense, there has clearly been philosophical progress.
Yes.
And that has arisen in part out of the religious and theological traditions. Although the question of its relationship to psychological development or maturity is a very complicated one. I mean, there's a question of how much thinking about religion in general, or relating to ideas of divinity or gods, is itself psychologically adaptive, useful, etc. Something to come back to at a later stage.